Hello and welcome back to Warrior Radio. My name is Tony Balbin, and in today's episode I sit down with Julia Mossbridge, and she's the CEO and research director of the Mossbridge Institute, and she's also an advisor for tech startups such as Entangled and Focus Will, and she's also the visiting scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, or IONS. And to me, IONS is one of the coolest organizations I've come across. And the best way I can describe it is, think if really, really smart minds explored topics of the mind, typically dominated by people like hippies or woo-woo folks and sort of the new age crowd. But they study these topics such as synchronicity, telepathy, mediumship, things like energy healing. They study all these things under the lens of science. And, with that comes a scientific process, which means objectivity, measurements, facts, and it goes through the rigors of the scientific process. And all the fluff, all the vagueness, and a lot of the irrational thoughts around these topics are just taken out of the equation. So that's why it's really, really fascinating for me to talk to someone like Julia, who works at IONS. And she specializes in how time is perceived by the conscious and non-conscious aspects of ourselves. And so we get into this topic in this interview, which leads us to talk about things like, phenomena like predicting the future and intuition and, other interesting topics like that. So I think you're really going to enjoy it. If you do, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and rate us and let us know what you think of this episode or the podcast in general, because it always helps give us constructive feedback on making this better for you guys. So with all that said, I want to present you with Julia Mossbridge. Enjoy. For those that don't know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure, yeah. My name's Julia Mossbridge. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist and experimental psychologist with the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And then I hold a visiting scholar appointment at Northwestern University. And I do consulting for various startups. So one of the startups I do consulting for is Focus Will Labs, which is a music for focus service.
Awesome. So how did you get into this field of sort of neuroscience and sort of mixed with spirituality? Just because there's not too many people in this field that are thought leaders, and I'd love to get to know your story of how you sort of got into this field.
So I've always been interested in science. As a kid, I was raised by a physicist dad and a clinical psychologist mom. And I think there's a part of me that kind of wanted to take them both together. Sort of like the marriage didn't work out, but I wanted to make the melding of, hard science and inner exploration. I wanted to make that work out. And so that's certainly got to be part of it psychologically. And then the other part are just experiences I've had in my life that are very difficult to explain under the current scientific paradigm. I'm very scientifically focused and I'm well trained scientifically, but I guess I shouldn't say but, and I find myself more and more using that scientific training to examine these kind of events that are very difficult to explain and actually easy to forget once they happen to you, because they're so out of the normal step of your daily life, and they're so unusual and difficult to understand that actually they happen to a lot of people, and many people just push them aside and say, I'll never understand that, or maybe I'm just crazy or whatever it is. And then there's plenty of evidence that, in fact, there's something going on here that we're not talking about. So That's the kind of thing that draws me.
Well, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, you guys explore a lot of these different issues like synchronicity and, out-of-body experiences. And you had a talk on how time and the unconscious mind, or how the unconscious mind processes times, which I'd love to get into.
Sure.
But just to set a foundation for those listening, can you just briefly describe just the difference between consciousness, unconsciousness, and I know there's a lot of terms for this other one, but cosmic consciousness?
Yeah, great. That's a wonderful question. Right. So consciousness is, you can kind of define it at this point. There's so many different definitions of consciousness. It's almost like each person has their own, who's in the field. But sort of the way I think of it is as, I guess, a neuroscientist would think of it. So consciousness is the thing that happens to you when you're awake and you're not under general anesthetic and you're not asleep, or you're not in deep sleep. So it is the one quick way to, I guess, define it would be the state of having experiences in your waking daily life. And then there's alterations of that consciousness, but in any case, they're all related to this this idea of having experiences. Now, cosmic consciousness. Well, let me talk about non-consciousness or unconsciousness next. So, sort of non-consciousness, I think of as everything that's not what I just said. So, everything that's not a state of having experiences. So, for instance, two examples. I'm conscious of talking with you right now, and I am not conscious of what it is like to currently be like the third neuron from the left in my hippocampus, right? Like that neuron may have its own consciousness, but right now, I'm conscious of talking with you, right? So that's one example of something that's non-conscious. Another example is all of the processes that my brain and body require in order for me to speak in any kind of coherent way to you, right? So I'm not aware of that, but it's happening. And so the reason I bring up another example of non-consciousness is deep sleep. Now, there may be some kind of consciousness that does happen during deep sleep, and that's a controversy, but because we don't remember having experiences, we end up having to count it by this definition as a state of non-consciousness. So the reason I bring up these kind of examples is to point out that most of our lives is dominated to an incredible extent by things of which we are not conscious. So we're at the tip of the iceberg, and non-consciousness is the huge bulk of what's going on, and that's below the surface of the water. So now in terms of cosmic consciousness, so this is an idea that goes very far back, but sort of most recently William James in the early 1900s or maybe late 1800s, I think it was early 1900s, talked about cosmic consciousness as being sort of where if we're each of us trees and we seem independent above the earth, beneath the earth, the roots connect with one another and in this common ground area where the disconnection that we see physically above the ground is erased, and he called it cosmic consciousness, this connection below the mother sea or reservoir, which is what he called it. But in any case, it's such a beautiful turn of phrase. But this idea that we're only generally conscious of being above that. And then in some states, we can get aware of this other kind of connected or extended consciousness. And what's ironic and kind of funny about this whole thing is that if you use the neuroscientist's definition of consciousness, so it's the stuff that's happening while you're aware, or it is the state of being aware. And so if the opposite of that is non-consciousness, then this thing that William James called cosmic consciousness, and that meditators and yoga people also tend to call cosmic consciousness, that very thing is in fact non-conscious for most people, right? So that's a piece of what's non-conscious, is this thing that's in fact almost an extended or broadened consciousness. So that just goes to show you that people don't know how to talk to each other about ideas.
Yeah. So in terms of processing time, how does the consciousness, unconsciousness, and even cosmic consciousness, how does that differ between the three with processing time?
Yeah, so I generally when I talk about time, I like to try to talk about it as processing events in time. because that's really how we experience time, as far as I can tell. We don't, time itself, there's no sense that processes time. Time is processed through events. We basically infer that time exists based on events. And in fact, those inferences change based on the events. So everyone knows that if you're in a boring lecture, time drags, right?
Yep.
And if you're like on a first date with someone you think is really awesome, time speeds up. And so, because we have no primary ability to sort of perceive time itself, it's all about processing events. Now, in terms of consciousness, cosmic consciousness and non-consciousness, in terms of events and time, it's pretty clear that our way of knowing about things in our daily waking consciousness is that we cannot necessarily apply what we learn there to sort of the rest of the universe. In other words, to everything of which we are non-conscious. And the reason I say this is not only, for instance, I mean, in a way, you could think about quantum mechanics this way, right? So in our classical worldview, which is our waking daily conscious awareness using our perceptions, it appears that, objects are where they are and that particles exist and that they don't depend on our observation, right? Mm-hmm. As soon as you go into quantum mechanics, sort of some of these basic sort of intuitions about the way things work that we get from our conscious waking perceptions don't work. So that's an analogy for what I'm about to say, which is in the same vein, our waking perceptions about about what is out there in the world, we already know even through simple experiments like visual illusion experiments, right? We know that our waking daily intuitions about what's out there don't actually always match with what really is out there. And so that opens up the door, even just those visual experiments and the quantum mechanics thing, they open up the door to wondering, so how does the non-conscious processes, of which constitute the bulk of the bottom of this iceberg, how do they process events in time? And so we can do experiments that give us clues about that. So you can get clues about these non-conscious processes by looking at physiology. So, for instance, an experiment that I've done in the past is you give people 4 images on a screen. They're not very interesting images, but their job is to consciously pick which of the 4 images they think is going to be the one that is presented to them in the future. And, they look at you cross-eyed when you ask them to do this because you're asking them to predict the future. And you just say, I know it's crazy. Please do it. And at the same time, in that experiment, I was recording their skin conductance and their heartbeats. And what I found, and this is a replication of something Dean Radin had found, like a decade earlier. But what I found is that people were no good consciously at predicting the future. Well, we already know that, right? For the most part, people are not great at predicting the future when it's totally random, right?
Right.
But that, in terms of their physiology, in other words, the things of which they were non-conscious, you could map their physiology prior to their picking which of those 4 images was going to show up to their success or failure. So their heartbeat and their skin conductance looked different depending on whether they were about to click on an image that was the winner versus the image that was not the winner. And then I ended up replicating this using a smartphone app looking at heartbeats. So it's now pretty clear to me and a bunch of other people who are looking in this field that your non-conscious ability to process events in time includes information from future events that in our conscious awareness we see as unpredictable.
Can you talk a little bit about that further? Because you talk about how the sort of the unconsciousness, it processed just a greater amount of time from the past, the future, and the present to make decisions compared to consciousness, which really just deals with the present to make decisions and whatnot. So can you talk a little bit about this, how the unconsciousness sort of has a greater input?
Yeah, totally. And I just want to say, you say unconsciousness, and most people do because we're trained about the unconscious, and I try to evolve that into non-conscious because unconscious actually specifically refers to like this part of the mind that Freud talked about.
Okay. Yep.
Right? But non-conscious includes not only that part of the mind, but everything of which we are non-conscious. So like also like your toe. right?
Yeah.
So it also turns out, I think what you're referring to is that it also turns out that not only are these non-conscious processes skilled at picking up information about future events, such as it exists at the present moment, but they're also skilled at reaching further back in the past. So like one of the examples I gave, so we already know that if you hypnotize someone, for instance, and talk to the processes that are normally non-conscious, you can get more information about an event than you could if you just asked someone what happened, right? So we know that. But then there's a really neat experiment. That was not my experiment, but that was done. Oh gosh, I don't have the authors memorized, but I'm sure people could Google it and find it. Like I might Google it right now while I'm talking with you, so I can give the authors. But anyway, they did this neat experiment on cell phone selection. So they were testing this idea of the unconscious thought theory, which is a really neat theory that says that that frankly our non-conscious process, what I'm calling non-conscious processes, are much better at making complex choices when there are a lot of variables than our conscious awareness. And when I say better, I mean like mathematically better. So, we know the right answer when you give someone 16 different factors. You can mathematically figure out, what the right answer to a question about something is. But consciously, people can't really deal with that many factors. But unconsciously, they can. There's a parallel processing that's going on as opposed to the serial processing that's happening in the conscious mind. So anyway, in this experiment, and I'll have to let go trying to find those authors, but hopefully someone can find it. But in this experiment, they gave a bunch of students 2 images of cell phones, and they said, imagine you're shopping for a cell phone, and we're going to give you some information about the features of these cell phones. And at the beginning, they gave the students one of the cell phones, let's say cell phone A, they gave them 4 really positive points about the cell phone. And then cell phone B, they gave them 4 really negative points. So at that point, it was really clear which was the better cell phone. Then they took a break, and they had the group of students work on something that was distracting. All of the students worked on something that was distracting. Then they came back and they said, okay, back to the cell phones. We're going to give you a few more pieces of information about the cell phones. Then for cell phone A, they gave them 2 pieces of good and 2 pieces of bad information. And for cell phone B, they gave them 2 pieces of good and 2 pieces of bad information. So after the break, the information about the cell phones was equivalent, right? So if you only remembered information after the break, you would think there was no difference between the cell phone. If you actually integrated the information before the break, you would realize that the first cell phone was better than the second cell phone. So then they went ahead and they split the group in half, and half the group went ahead and just off the top of your head, just tell us what cell phone you think is best. And the other group, after a period of time, so there was an equivalent amount afterwards between the 2 groups. And the second group, they said, work on this very difficult task, and then think deliberatively, in other words, sit around and deliberate, try to make the best choice consciously about which you think is the best cell phone. And the people who sat around and consciously tried to make the best choice, they thought the cell phones were equivalent. And the people who just from your gut, just let us know, we're going to distract you with something else and just let us know what you think is best, they actually made, on average, the right choice, which was the first cell phone. So that's an example of this kind of thing, of reaching further back in the past. In other words, with your conscious mind, they could only handle the most recent information, and with the non-conscious processes, they could reach further back into the past.
Wow, that's really, really interesting. And you also talk about how what we perceive in reality might not be an accurate representation of true reality itself. You touched on this a little bit, but could we talk a little bit about this further? Just because there's a lot of people that read a lot of Eastern religious texts, and this is a theme that continually pops up in things like Hinduism and Buddhism, and that reality is what you're perceiving isn't true reality itself. It's sort of
the
an
Matrix
illusion.
Kind of thing.
Right, exactly. So can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah. I mean, once you start thinking about it, it can easily start freaking you out. So that's a warning. Do you want to take the red pill?
Yeah.
Or I forget, is it the blue pill or the red pill? But in any case, so there's, so we have to remember that the information that we get about what's going on around us is all happening in our conscious awareness. That's really our only source of information. There's no experience that you can have. I mean, by definition, if you're defining conscious awareness as the state of having experiences, if you think of a set theory, there's the only things that are in the set of consciousness are experiences, and there's nothing that is an experience that's not in that set. Otherwise, it would be part of consciousness, right? So that's our source of information. That's our sole source of information. So sort of in a way, my sense is that we have been kind of duped over the last century or so, or probably more than the last century, into believing that the chair that I am sitting on is more real than my own thoughts. When in fact, the only thing that you really know is real is that you're having thoughts, and the chair is an inference from those thoughts. So it's sort of exactly the opposite of the way most people think about the world, right? I'm not sure my inner state exists, but I'm sure that this object, this table, this chair, this food, I'm sure that exists. And we're sort of almost taught that. I mean, it's compounded by the way science is taught, right? So science these days is taught about it's all about everything but nothing, but not you. Mm. Ironically, given that the only organisms we know about that do science are humans, so it's pretty interesting that humans kind of have to be involved in science. Right. But, and almost all of the interesting bits of science are done in someone's mind. In fact, I would argue all of them. What else is interesting about it? So once you flip that and recognize that really, if you want to be very conservative about what you know about the world, then you have to admit that all you know is what your experience is, and that's it. Like, even if you use a ruler to measure something to convince you that it's a certain length, you use your eyes to look at the ruler. Or even if you use a scale to put something on, right? Or if you use a telescope, or if you're doing a quantum mechanical experiment and you're looking at the numbers that are coming out of the experiment, those are all, without a single exception, your experience. And so if your experience is lying to you, then what do you have? Mm. Right? And so Donald Hoffman, who's at UC Irvine, who would be a great podcast person, by the way, Donald Hoffman at UC Irvine has asked the question. He's a visual neuroscientist and a computer science guy. And he's asked the question, what would it look like if we made little automata, little creatures, little agents that are artificial, they're just software, but they had very simple rules. And he looked at their evolution. And what would happen if, in the evolution of these creatures, if we gave them a lot of information that's exactly correct about their environment? And what would it look like for them, another group of little agents, if we gave them less information about their environment? And what would it look for another set of agents if we didn't give them any correct information about their environment, but we gave them useful information about their environment? So they didn't actually perceive that there were 2 points of food if they moved, 6 pixels to the left. What they perceived was that moving 6 pixels to the left might feel good. Or something, right? So they got useful information about their actions, but not necessarily accurate information about their actions. And when he and I'm paraphrasing all this stuff, but anyway, when he put all these into a big mix and let them run to see who survived in the environment in order to mate, and the environment has things like shelter and food and stuff in it. He's done this experiment a ton of times and written a bunch of papers about it. And what ends up happening is that the agents that get useful information but not accurate information are the ones that win. Because accurate information isn't actually that helpful. What you need to survive is useful information. And useful information can look nothing like what the thing is, right? So you have to know, as a human, you have to know that food is for eating, right? And so food can look a certain way, like bright colored fruit, for instance. It can look a certain way that draws you to it. But that's how it looks to our perceptions. But, if you're a bee, it looks very different. And if you're to your non-conscious mind, it may be getting actually accurate information about what the fruit actually looks like, which could look like a monkey. I mean, we have no idea, right?
Yeah.
So I think that if we're going to be very conservative and really use the scientific method, we ought to say, kind of reframe science and say, look, science is the study of how we think things are going based on our conscious perceptions, and maybe we can get clues through various means, like Donald Hoffman's method, or my method of looking at physiology, or other people's methods. Maybe we can get clues, but maybe we can't, because maybe it's circular. Maybe me looking at the physiology results is just exactly like looking through a telescope. You're still using your experiences, and so it's tricky to think about. And Plato wanted to have this thing of direct access, where people could directly access knowledge. We're stuck. We're looking at the shadows on the cave wall. We're stuck in the cave. We can't get any other information but the shadows, so we infer what's going on outside the cave, and we could be totally wrong. But then there's this piece of like direct mathematical insight, and that is the possibility that could exist, that you could have some kind of direct mathematical or intuitive insight into reality, is what drives the other piece of my work, which is around looking at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And Noetic is about inner wisdom. And so that there's this idea that you could have that seems to me the only way to have another source to compare with this perceptual input that we get in our conscious waking state. And I think that those intuitions come from this cosmic consciousness. And the best thing is when you've got them matching up. You have your observations of what's happening in the world that's giving you clues about what's really going on in physical reality, and that matches up with your intuition. It's no good to just have an intuition without another way to check it. And it's no good to just have an observation without another way to check it. So I feel like they have to work together.
Yeah. Is there any, when people come to you and ask, like, I want to have access to this, like you were saying, but I want to have it sort of experientially instead of just an idea. I want to actually experience it, to actually feel it and taste it and actually get into it itself. Is there any methods that you tend to recommend to people, or certain types of technology that you recommend for people to try out to sort of get this deeper access to wisdom for themselves?
Yes. So I do get that question a lot. And it's funny because as soon as something comes up from your intuition and enters your consciousness, now it's your conscious awareness. But there's a difference between conscious awareness or conscious events that are experiences of what we call the outside world, and conscious awareness of events of experiences of essentially our inside world. Like these intuitions are more like our inside world, right? And so, the short answer is, there is no proven, to my knowledge, there's no scientific, rigorously proven method with how to do that, because there's just not enough funding in this area. And we spend most of our funding as scientists in this area, most of our time finding funding that then will just show that the phenomena exist, because there's so many people who don't believe they exist. So that's pretty much what we spend most of our time doing. I'm excited for the time when we can move towards how do we train this. And I know in the next decade we will be moving towards that, because more and more people are starting to recognize that this stuff exists. And so that's really good. But so I can only speak anecdotally from what I have experienced and what others have experienced. And the stories that you hear when you're in this field, I'll go give a talk somewhere at some mainstream institution and everyone will listen politely. And then afterwards, a group of people will privately come up to me separately and say, well, don't tell anyone I'm talking to you about this, but I have to tell you about this experience. And my response is always, you must talk to each other. Stop telling me all of your crazy experiences that are really real. And if you just talk to each other, you realize that you're all having this, But anyway, what I've gleaned is that letting go of control in terms of saying, okay, I'm going to learn this, and then I'm going to do this with it, and this is what's going to happen. The journey ends up always being different than what you set out. Just being willing to, in a space of safety, psychological safety, spiritual safety, whatever you want to call it, and awareness, being able to let go and allow yourself to find the next step and let things bubble up. It's a discipline because in our culture, it's the same discipline actually as fostering creativity, because in our culture, we tend to praise people who are creative or who are intuitive, but we seem to value the conscious sort of BS a lot, sort of the storytelling of the conscious mind that is can be almost useless. So it's a trick of saying, I'm going to let this thing that I can't control, and that actually you will find as you do this, you realize it basically controls you. I'm going to let this thing that I can't control come to me in a safe way with information about what to do next or about to whom to speak next to start this process. And what can help is to have a notebook or something in which you write inspirations, intuitions, precognitions, telepathic experiences, synchronicities, anything that would normally be considered hogwash. And you write it down and you sort of date it. And the more you allow yourself to do this, the more sort of I call it a handshake will evolve between these non-conscious processes and your conscious awareness. It's like they have to get in collaborative relationship.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
have you had that experience with creativity and other things in your life?
Yeah, definitely. And it's normally always when things get quiet in my mind. So it's happen in meditation or float tanks. Sometimes it happens in psychedelic experiences. Or sometimes it happens just walking down the street and just, a blip of intuition will sort of arise. But I think, it's something that most of the listeners that are on this sort of same path, it's not hogwash to people that have actually experienced it. And the great thing with Noetic that you guys actually explore some of these things. Like you've explored things like synchronicity and energy healers and things like that. And I'd love to get into some of those areas that you guys have sort of explored. Something like synchronicity, for example. Do you have any studies that you guys have done where you've explored this, or any particular case studies that come to mind with synchronicity?
It's interesting. So scientifically, synchronicity from the experimental end gets divided into things like telepathy, pre-cognition, and psychokinesis. So what those are, synchronicity is what Carl Jung wrote about, which is this experience that an event occurred that has meaning for the person to whom it occurred, and that it seems extremely coincidental. So Carl Jung's famous story about synchronicity is he has a client. Carl Jung is a psychologist. He has a client who doesn't believe in synchronicity and doesn't want to listen to his theories about it. And this is annoying to Carl Jung, but in any case, the client reports a dream in one of their sessions about this beetle, this bright colored beetle that was like a scarab, and that Carl Jung, I think he had it in his mouth or something like that. But at that moment, a knock on the window comes, and they realize this bright-colored beetle is trying to get in the window. They open the window, and it flies right into the session and lands on either Carl Jung or the patient. And then from then on, the patient's like, all right, I get it. So so that's like synchronicity. Now, when we study that, for the most part here, we break it down into instances of telepathy. So an experience in which you're sharing a mental information with someone else through means that are not like a video or cell phone or something. Precognition, which is knowing something about the future that it seems that you couldn't possibly have known beforehand. And in that case with the scarab would be like a precognition case, potentially. Or psychokinesis, which is mind over matter, mental effects on matter, like random number generators and such. So we've investigated those three for decades. And then another one that we've more recently investigated is mediumship. So talking with, I think we worked with the Windbridge Institute, which is it was basically the foremost scientific investigator of mediumship, which is getting information about people who have passed through mediums. And so those are the scientific fields we've investigated here. And in terms of synchronicity, there's a fellow who is one of our interns. His name is Sky Nelson. He's a master's physics student. And he is working on a mathematical description of synchronicity, which I think is very interesting. Would you like to talk about those areas of research and what we've found?
Yeah, definitely. If you could just sort of continue what you were just saying with that recent study that study that you were just talking about. That sounds really interesting.
Do you mean Sky Nelson's work?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, you know what? You really need to ask him about it. He took me. I was at a conference. He took the whole group through his mathematical theory of synchronicity. I can briefly state that, from what I understand, he sees each moment that he comes from a quantum mechanical background, and he says, look, when you make a decision, a choice of any kind, you're cutting off another part of the decision tree, and that's what you need to do to make progress. But the way synchronicity works is it leans you towards a certain branch of the decision tree that contains more elements of meaning for you. And so eventually, if you keep sort of following your intuition, you're going to be going down the decision tree, and naturally you're going to have synchronicities because you're on the part of the tree that has a bunch of essentially like little fruits that are meaningful to you.
Wow.
So it's very interesting. So I think
and we'll have links for all of this on the blog post for those that are listening.
Good. I'll try to get you a link to that one as well.
Yeah, definitely. But you're also talking about the medium shifts. Did you guys have any studies that you've done sort of exploring this and tracking it?
Yeah, we can link to our mediumship study. So first of all, definitely link to Windbridge Institute.
Mm-hmm.
But Arnaud Delorme here worked with some folks at the Windbridge Institute and to do this mediumship study that was on Frontiers. Very interesting story. Frontiers is a mainstream scientific journal. A lot of people read it because it's free to read. So it's an open access journal. And interestingly, they had a very fascinating result where the task for the mediums was to look at a set of pictures that they very carefully selected from the high school yearbooks of people who are now in their 70s and 80s. But they're the high school pictures of these people. And they very carefully showed each picture to the mediums using a bunch of different equalization software that made sure that each image was not seemingly different than another image. And they asked each medium, is this person that you're seeing alive or dead now? And so it was a way to test a different kind of mediumship than is normally tested, right?
Yeah.
And they found that several of the mediums could do this at a rate above chance. On average, they were well above chance. And they looked at the brain activity in the mediums as they were doing this, and that was very interesting. And then the Windbridge Institute, Julie Beischel spearheaded a series of studies. She would be another great guest to have on. Mm-hmm. And they have done two original study and a replicated study that are the best the world has seen to date, as far as I can tell. In terms of showing in blinded conditions, I believe they have a quadruple blind protocol, so the mediums don't know who they're doing readings for. The experimenter doesn't know the person the medium's doing a reading for. The judges of the readings who determine whether the reading's appropriate for the person don't know who the person is because they're giving multiple, I think they're giving 2 or 3 readings, one from the person that the medium is trying to talk to, the dead person, right? Their information about that person, and another from another dead person, and they're trying to figure out if that medium is correctly giving information for the person that they were supposed to be reading. And the mediums are only given the first names of the people, so like they get Joe. Tell us everything about Joe.
Wow.
So there's just it's airtight and statistically significant information in both papers.
Wow.
So pretty convincing.
Yeah.
I mean, so I have a new book out actually that details all this evidence that we're talking about. Can I plug the book?
Yeah, definitely. Let us know the name of it, when's it coming out, and all the details.
It's already out. It's called Transcendent Mind, and it's published by the American Psychological Association Books, so it's a textbook. That's why it's a little pricey. It's actually for classroom use, but a lot of people are finding it to be very good, so I'm excited about that.
Well, awesome. We'll definitely have the link on the blog post for you guys to check out.
Cool.
And check that book out if you found this interview interesting. But you also talked about energy healers, or something that was at least on my notes that I wanted to touch on.
Yeah.
Have you guys done any studies on exploring energy healers?
Oh, yeah. So that would go in the category, in our categories that I mentioned, that would go in the psychokinesis category. So using the mind to influence something in the physical world that is not in your body, right? Yeah. So normally healing goes through this mechanistic method where you give someone a medicine or you give them a massage or whatever it is. You touch them in some way, whether with a medicine or with your body, and that has a change. And so the idea is, well, what are thoughts, or there's something people call energy that is really poorly defined. What if that can heal people? And so we have done a few studies on that, and the person who knows most about that would be Dean Radin, and he's the guy to talk to about that. But generally, it looks like there's a ton of different modalities. Some of them seem to work. Some of them don't seem to work. Overall, if you take the data overall for energy healing, or that in experiments where people are looking at energy healing, it's confusing because you're mixing in, it's such a new field that a new kind of modality shows up every day. So you're mixing in modalities that might be just completely at the level of placebo with modalities that really work. And so it's really, in my impression, is that it's a toss-up right now in terms of making conclusions. I think we need, major meta-analyses that put together certain kinds of healing, and some of those have been done, and one of them is for healing touch, which is practiced in a lot of hospitals. Actually, there are nurses who are involved in healing touch, and that seems to be powerful. It looks like prayer might be powerful. That's healing at a distance.
Wow.
So that's pretty neat.
How are ways that how are ways that you guys what are the different modalities that are sort of generally accepted, and what are the different sort of metrics and ways that you track sort of the effectiveness of an energy healer?
Yeah, I'm not the right person to ask about that. Just because I'm mostly on the more statistical physiology side.
Yep.
Yeah. So I want to be able to answer that, but I think you're better off talking to Dean or someone about that.
Okay. No worries. And just to switch things up a little bit, I'd love to talk a little bit about technology, because it's something that you've been involved in with different apps and different sort of trans tech companies. Just you personally, are there any sort of transformative technologies that you personally use and that's benefited you?
Oh, for sure. There's a couple of them. I mean, I guess I could plug my own app, which I use. Mm-hmm. So my own app is called Choice Compass. Yep. And it uses your heartbeat to help you make decisions about 2 life choices. And I am kind of amazed at it. I mean, I tested it on hundreds of people, so I shouldn't be amazed at it. So, statistically, it's pretty clear that there's a mathematical difference in your heart rhythm when you're thinking about something that's positive for you versus something that's not as positive for you. But I still get surprised by it. So someone just told me a story today of her daughter who was using it to try to make a decision about whether she should get a particular vaccine. And it tells her no, she shouldn't get the vaccine. And she's like, well, I don't know. And she starts thinking about it some more. And then 5 minutes later, she's in the doctor's office because this is where she's trying to decide right at the last minute about the vaccine. She faints. And the nurse says to her, no vaccine for you. Not today.
It's a pretty clear sign from her.
So she was like,
yep.
okay, maybe I should trust my heart when it says that stuff.
Yeah.
So very interesting. So that's one, but there are many. So another one is called the Kasina, Kasina.
Yep.
Mind place. Do you know about this?
Yeah, that's the Light and Mind machine, from what I understand.
I love it.
Yeah. That one's a great
love
one.
It. Yeah, they worked really hard and had a ton of trial and error and a ton of science behind trying to figure out what works for people. And there's something on that one called deep rejuvenation. There's a setting on that called deep rejuvenation that absolutely I feel afterwards like my bone marrow has been regenerated.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's an awesome one. Also, the best place to find out about emerging transcendence tech is, I think, where I go, which is to go to consciousnesshacking.org. Mikey Siegel, who founded Consciousness Hacking, he keeps, it's also just going to a meetup in your area. I think almost every major city has a meetup at this point. But you can meet people who are working on these things, and they're all, a bunch of them are early stage startups, and it's super exciting.
Yeah.
So that's and then also, of course, the Transformative technology website. And also at IONS, we have the Transcendence technology movement. So this is technology that helps people connect with something beyond themselves. So we're sort of this cosmic mind. And you can read about that at the noetic.org/innovation page.
Let's talk a little bit more about the choice compass, because what's the story behind that? So was that an area that you were already sort of studying, exploring, or is there a story where sort of this sort of emerged from?
Yeah, I started reading about what HeartMath. Do you know the organization HeartMath?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what they had been doing with heartbeats, and then I started thinking about my own work where heartbeats could differentiate these future events, and then I thought, I don't know if it's possible, but maybe that heartbeats could help people make choices. And then I just got a bee in my bonnet, and I just thought, let's find out if it's possible. So I actually had to build the algorithm with a developer who was excellent, David Mix. I had to build the algorithm for getting the heartbeat, because at this point I was working on it before we had phones that got the heartbeat from the camera lens, know?
Yep.
So I built it myself, trial and error. And, we had to build it together, the developer and I, and we got that. And once we got that, then I could go, armed with the psychophysiology knowledge I already had, I could go into the end users and ask hundreds of them, just think about a really positive thing, think about a really negative thing, and then I could look at their heartbeats offline and look with the math and determine the difference. And one really interesting story about that was that men and women on average, or at least women of reproductive age and men on average, have generally opposing heart rhythms. So the heart rhythms the mathematics of the heart rhythms for women when they're thinking about something really positive seem to be almost, but not exactly, the inverse of the mathematics for men when they're thinking about something that's positive. So I had to make two algorithms according to gender. And then I discovered through more beta testing that women who are postmenopausal almost uniformly had to switch their gender settings to male.
Wow.
So then I decided, all right, there's a hormonal component. And then I found out that women who are of reproductive age and still getting their periods would have to change their setting, sort of calibrate it during their cycle. So I thought, okay, this is a hormonal difference. This is fascinating. So I'm still trying to understand the hormonal difference, but it ties into some of my other work in using your physiology to predict future events. I just got a grant to pursue the hormonal piece of that, because it looks like hormones play a difference in that. So if we could nail that in terms of the future event piece and hormones, that would really give us a leg up into understanding what the heck is going on there.
Yeah. And as far as just future tech that's coming out in the next few years, maybe even the next decade, is there anything that most excites you that you see in the horizon?
Yeah, lots of things I can't talk about. But in general, I think using augmented and virtual reality as a way of hacking the mind is, going to be huge, but also as a way of hacking the body. So as a way of doing healing, I think is going to be really huge. And the other piece of it is I do think that in the next decade or so, people will start believing these results, and then we'll be using information from the future collectively, from people's unconscious minds or non-conscious processes collectively as a population to get information that's helpful to us. And I think that'll be really valuable.
Awesome. And as far as books, just in your own life, what types of books have been most transformative for you, and what types of books do you find yourself recommending to, friends, families, colleagues, and whatnot?
It's always whatever I'm reading. I get super enthusiastic about the very book I'm reading. I don't have much time to read out of my area of research because I'm just completely booked all the time.
Yeah.
But I do every once in a while read science fiction and read naturalist stories about nature. And I just recently read this book by Cy Montgomery about octopodi, the plural of octopuses, and consciousness and what's going on there with them and their consciousness is very interesting. But mostly it's work, reading papers and speed reading books, which isn't as pleasurable.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. That will again be on the links on the blog post. But if folks wanted to learn more about you and what you do, and where can they find all that stuff online?
They could go to mossbridgeinstitute.com, or they could go to noetic.org/innovation.
All right. That was Julia Mossbridge of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And I want to say a special thanks to her for sitting down with me. If you enjoyed this episode, go check out her stuff at themossbridgeinstitute.com, and go check out her book, which is called The Transcendent Mind, Rethinking the Science of Consciousness. And she also has that app called Choice Compass that'll help you make important decisions in your life with heart intelligence in mind. And if you enjoyed this episode and if you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe to the podcast, Warrior Radio. Subscribe, rate us, and let us know what you think, because it always gives us better feedback to make this thing better and help grow this project. And with all that said, I want to say thank you for sitting down with me today. Hopefully this talk expanded your mind a little bit, and I will see you on the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.